Argentina was the 7th richest country on earth in 1913, ahead of France and Germany, with a peso that traded at par with the US dollar. 113 years later, that same peso has lost 99.99% of its value, and Javier Milei wants to abolish it entirely. If your country has been running large structural deficits for years, the playbook you're about to see is already happening there. Argentina's path is showing up right now in slow motion in the United States, across the Eurozone, in Japan, in Britain, in India, and in every country that borrows more than it earns. You're just earlier on the timeline than Argentina was. Every analysis of Argentina blames Perón, the generals, or commodity crashes. The real story sits underneath all of them. Across 100 years, Argentina ran the same playbook over and over, each time finding a fresh way to transfer wealth from the people who earned it to the people who controlled the rules. Here's how it worked, who got rich, and which moves are already running in your country. To understand how Argentina lost the 20th century, you have to understand how it won the 19th century. And the answer is uncomfortable, because Argentina got rich the way most countries got rich in the 1800s, by taking land that didn't belong to them and turning it into export agriculture. In 1879, a general named Julio Argentino Roca led a military campaign called the Conquest of the Desert. It killed or displaced roughly 15,000 indigenous people across the pampas, the vast, fertile plain south of Buenos Aires. The land that opened up afterwards, hundreds of millions of acres, went to about 300 politically connected families. By 1900, those 300 families controlled most of the productive land in one of the most agriculturally rich countries on earth. The money to develop that land came from London. British investors financed the railways across the pampas, the refrigerated meat plants that opened in 1882, the port works in Buenos Aires, and the sovereign debt that paid for everything else. By 1913, British capital owned roughly 1/3 of all the productive assets in the country. Argentina exported beef and wheat, and the profits and interest payments flowed straight back to the City of London. The peso, meanwhile, was put on a gold peg in 1899 through an institution called the Caja de Conversión. Argentine money was, on paper, as good as gold, and foreign investors believed it. The government had to either earn or borrow gold every time it wanted to spend more. The currency was disciplined because the politicians had no choice. For about 30 years, all of this looked spectacular. Buenos Aires built the Teatro Colón, still one of the great opera houses in the world. The Avenida de Mayo was modeled on Paris. The metro opened in 1913, the fourth subway system on Earth, ahead of Madrid and Tokyo. Almost 6 million European immigrants arrived between 1870 and 1914, a larger proportional wave than the United States absorbed in the same period. The Economist genuinely called Argentina the country of the future. What Argentina actually was, though, was a country that looked developed on the surface, but was structured like a colony underneath. 300 families owned most of the productive land. British investors held most of the productive capital. The peso stayed hard only because the law required it to. And the immigrants who were supposed to build Argentina's middle class ended up working for those same families instead. Take a look at the Gulf states right now, or Brazil. Those countries look rich because the commodity money is real and the GDP charts are climbing. But ask yourself, who's actually capturing all that wealth? And ask what happens when the commodity cycle turns. That's exactly where Argentina was in 1913. The country looked spectacular on the surface, but the actual money was already concentrating in the hands of a small landowning class and the British investors who held the railway bonds. In 1916, Argentina held its first election with universal male suffrage. The winner was a man named Hipólito Yrigoyen, leader of a party called the Radical Civic Union. He was the first Argentine president who didn't come from the 300 families that ran the country. His base was the urban middle class, and he had to deliver something for them. The problem was that the productive land and the productive capital were already in other people's hands, and the only thing the government actually controlled was its own spending. So Yrigoyen used what he had. He started spending heavily on public works, on the new urban civil service, and on salaries for his political base. When the tax revenue ran out, he found something every politician eventually finds. The Caja de Conversión could be suspended, and the peso, that had been disciplined for 30 years, could now be flexed. This move had been used before Yrigoyen got to it. The First World War had already given the government cover to suspend the gold peg years before he took office. But he set the precedent that every Argentine government after him would follow. State spending could exceed state earnings any time politics demanded it. The currency was a tool politicians could use whenever they needed it. Look at the world's central banks right now. The Federal Reserve is under sustained political pressure from the Trump White House. The Bank of Japan has been accommodating its government's debt for 15 years straight, and the European Central Bank is running the same play. The independent central bank was a 20th century invention, and most major economies are quietly giving up on it. Yrigoyen got there in 1924, and the rest of the world is just catching up. Juan Perón came to power in 1946 with the most enthusiastic working class support any Argentine politician had ever received. His wife Eva, a former actress, became the public face of his welfare state. And the playbook he built between 1946 and 1955 is the one every Argentine government since has run a variant of. Here's what Perón actually did when he came in. He created an institution called IAPI, the Argentine Institute for the Promotion of Trade. IAPI was a state monopoly on grain exports. It bought wheat and beef from Argentine farmers at low domestic prices, then sold them abroad at high international prices, earning a profit for the state. The producers got a fraction of what their crops were actually worth, and the state captured the rest of the wealth. In 1948, Perón nationalized the British-owned railways, using the war credits Britain owed Argentina from World War II. The same year, he took over the central bank and seized control of foreign exchange. From that point on, every Argentine who wanted to buy dollars needed state permission, and every foreign company that wanted to send profits abroad needed state approval. The third move was a new political coalition. Perón built a tight relationship between the state, the labor unions through the CGT, and a new class of politically connected domestic industrialists. The unions got higher wages, the industrialists got protected markets and cheap state credit, and the state got political loyalty from both sides. The bill for all of this was paid by the rural producers, the savers, and anyone still holding pesos in a country that was now printing them faster than it had ever done before. By the time Perón was overthrown by the military in 1955, inflation had become a permanent feature of Argentine life. The wealth that had been concentrated in 300 families in 1900 was now being redistributed, but only to whoever happened to be politically useful to the regime at any given moment. Then, in 1956, the IMF arrived. The new military government called Washington and asked for help. And the first IMF program for Argentina was signed that year. It would be the first of 22. Today's policies like the CHIPS Act in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, the European Green Deal, India's PLY scheme, etc., use different vocabulary, but describe the same operation Perón ran in 1946. A government decides which industries deserve to win, funds those winners with debt or printed money, captures whatever export rents it can grab, and lets the inflation that follows eat through ordinary people's savings. Argentina, between 1955 and 1989, looked chaotic from the outside. There were military coups, then democratic returns, then more coups, then a brief Peronist return when the old man came back from exile in 1973, then the dirty war under the Videla junta, then the Falklands. By the end of this period, Argentina had cycled through 6 different generals running the country at different points, 4 different currency names along the way, and inflation that crossed 5,000% per year by 1989. But underneath all of the chaos, the same playbook kept running. Every regime, military or civilian, ran some version of state-led spending, currency manipulation, and politically directed credit. The names changed every few years, but the methods stayed identical. And the IMF was there for every iteration of this. The first Argentine IMF program was signed in 1956, right after Perón's overthrow. Between 1956 and 1989, Argentina signed 12 more of them, some under military juntas, including the Videla regime that ran the dirty war, and others under democratic governments, including the Alfonsín administration that took over after the 1983 transition. Every one of those programs followed the same pattern. The Argentine government had run out of money, the IMF lent dollars with austerity conditions attached, the government pretended to comply, the currency crashed anyway, and the next government inherited a slightly worse version of the same problem. By 1989, Argentina had been running the same loop for 33 years, and each iteration produced a worse outcome than the last. Inflation was running at 5,000% per year. People got paid weekly and spent everything they had the day they were paid because the money would lose half its value if they waited. Alfonsín resigned 6 months before his term ended because the situation had become unmanageable. If you're watching this from Turkey, you already know what's been happening there since 2018. Or if you're in Egypt, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka, you've been living through your own version of it since 2022. They're all running variations of the loop. Argentina was stuck in from 1955 to 1989. Argentina took 34 years to play it out, but the ones running it now might move a lot faster. In 1989, Carlos Menem won the presidency. He was a Peronist by party, but his economy minister was a Harvard-trained economist named Domingo Cavallo. And in 1991, Cavallo did something that looked, for a while, like it had solved Argentina's problem. The plan was called Convertibility, and on paper it looked simple. By law, 1 Argentine peso would equal 1 US dollar. The central bank could only print pesos if it held an equivalent amount of dollars in reserve. Inflation, which had been 5,000% in 1989, fell to almost zero by 1994. For a few years, this looked like a miracle. Foreign investment flooded in, and Argentine consumers could afford imports for the first time in a generation. The IMF, which was Cavallo's intellectual home, held Argentina up as the model for emerging market reform. But the underlying playbook was still running, just dressed differently. Menem privatized almost everything the state owned, including the national oil company YPF, the national airline, the telephone system, and the railways. The assets were sold at fire sale prices to a small group of politically connected domestic buyers and foreign multinationals. The wealth transfer was the same as before, just running through a different channel. And the convertibility plan had a hidden cost. Argentine prices stayed high in dollar terms, so Argentine exports became uncompetitive. When Brazil devalued its currency in 1999, Argentina's biggest trading partner suddenly became 40% cheaper. To keep the peg alive, the government borrowed dollars from abroad. By 2001, the foreign debt was enormous, and the IMF was the lender of last resort, keeping the system running. In December 2001, the IMF withdrew its support. The Argentine government did the only thing it had left. It froze every bank account in the country. This was called the Corralito, the little pen. Anyone who had pesos in a bank account could no longer withdraw them. People who held dollars in those accounts watched the bank forcibly convert those dollars into pesos at the official rate, which crashed within days. Ordinary savers lost roughly 75% of their wealth in less than a month. The people who had moved their dollars offshore in the months before December 2001 kept their wealth. Everyone who trusted the Argentine banking system lost almost everything. Argentina then defaulted on $93 billion of sovereign debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that point. 5 different presidents cycled through the office in 11 days, and the country burned through riots for weeks afterward. Argentina, in 2001, is the case study for what happens when a country borrows in a currency it can't print and pegs to a currency it doesn't control. You can see the same setup running right now in Sri Lanka, which defaulted in 2022, in Lebanon during its multi-year crisis from 2019 to today, and in Egypt's recent currency collapse. They all share the same architecture: foreign currency debt, an overvalued local currency, and a central bank that runs out of dollars at the worst possible moment. Argentina took 10 years to get there. The countries running that play now are getting there much faster. Nestor Kirchner won the presidency in 2003 in the aftermath of the Corralito. He had inherited an economy that had just experienced the worst sovereign default in modern history. His response was something Argentina had never quite tried before. Kirchner restructured Argentina's $93 billion in defaulted debt at 30 cents on the dollar. The foreign creditors who had been holding Argentine bonds took losses of 70% on average. And in 2006, Kirchner did something even more symbolic. He paid off Argentina's entire remaining IMF debt, almost $10 billion in a single payment. The official narrative was that Argentina was finally free of the IMF and the Washington Consensus. The reality was that Argentina had simply switched playbooks. Kirchner died in 2010, and his wife Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner continued the model. The Kirchner government rode an enormous commodity boom. Global demand for Argentine soybeans, especially from China, sent export revenues to record highs. The government imposed a tax on soybean exports called retenciones, which captured a large portion of the boom for the state budget. That tax was the same kind of move Perón's IAPI had been running 60 years earlier. The rural producers got a fraction of the boom, and the state captured the rest. The state then spent the proceeds aggressively on public employment, energy and transport subsidies, and welfare programs. Eventually, the spending ran ahead of even the soybean boom. So in 2011, the Kirchner government did what Yrigoyen had done in 1924 and what every Argentine government in between had done at some point. They put on capital controls. Argentines could no longer freely buy dollars at the official rate. The government rationed dollar access through a complex system of permissions, and a parallel currency market immediately emerged. People called it the dollar blue, the blue dollar. The official exchange rate said one thing, and the actual market rate said something very different. The government also began publishing fake inflation statistics. INDEC, the National Statistics Institute, was effectively forced to report inflation rates much lower than what Argentine households were actually experiencing. By 2015, when Cristina Kirchner's term ended, the country was running multiple exchange rates, 2 sets of inflation numbers, and was once again locked out of international capital markets. Multiple exchange rates and state-fudged inflation numbers used to be a uniquely Argentine quirk. Today, they show up across the developing world. Nigeria right now runs an official exchange rate that nobody can actually transact at, alongside a parallel rate that everybody uses. Egypt had 3 different exchange rates until 2024, depending on what you wanted to do. The dollar blue mentality is no longer a Latin American specialty. It's a tool any government can reach for when its currency stops working at the official price. The president Argentina elected in 2023 is unlike anyone the country has ever had, a man named Javier Milei. He's an economist by training, originally Keynesian, who converted to the Austrian school during graduate work. He's been a TV pundit, a columnist, and a rock musician in his spare time, having played in a Rolling Stones cover band. He owns 5 rescue dogs named after Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, Robert Lucas, and other free market economists. Milei describes his own politics as anarcho-capitalist. In practice, that means he believes the state should do almost nothing. He won the 2023 election by attacking what he called La Casta, the caste, meaning the entire Argentine political class that had run the country for the past 70 years. He campaigned with an actual chainsaw on stage, promising to cut through the state. Milei is the most ideologically opposite leader Argentina has ever produced. Every president before him, military or civilian, Peronist or radical, was operating somewhere on the spectrum of state-led economic policy. Milei rejects that entire spectrum and openly argues that the state itself is the problem. He's also an outlier in his own region. Lula is back in Brazil, Sheinbaum runs Mexico, continuing the project Andrés Manuel López Obrador started, Petro is in Colombia, and Boric is in Chile. Most of Latin America is running some version of the left populist policy Argentina itself invented under Perón. Milei is the one major Latin American economy going the opposite direction. He's done it by aligning closely with Donald Trump, withdrawing Argentina from the BRICS expansion that was scheduled to take effect in 2024, breaking diplomatic relations with Maduro's Venezuela, and pitching himself publicly as the anti-China voice in the region. So what has Milei actually done since taking office? He took a literal chainsaw to the federal government, cutting the number of ministries from 18 to 8, laying off tens of thousands of state employees, and eliminating entire subsidy programs for energy and transport. And in 2024, for the first time in over 100 years, Argentina ran a fiscal surplus. The peso, which had been losing value at more than 200% per year when he took office, stabilized. Inflation came down sharply, and the economy stopped collapsing for the first time in years. But what is most disturbing is that Milei campaigned on dollarization, the actual abolition of the peso. As of mid-2026, the peso is still the official currency of Argentina. The central bank still runs the country's monetary policy, and the state still has discretion over the currency, even though Milei is using that discretion more responsibly than any Argentine government has in a century. And Milei is running his entire presidency on IMF program number 22. Mauricio Macri took the previous IMF program in 2018, $57 billion, the largest in IMF history at the time. Alberto Fernandez restructured that loan during his term. Milei then inherited the wreckage and got Washington to provide more dollars to keep the operation alive. The IMF is co-piloting Milei's presidency, the same way it co-piloted Argentina's military juntas in the 1970s. Here's the deeper finding from 100 years of Argentine history. Milei is the most ideologically opposite leader Argentina has ever produced. If ideology actually mattered for changing the system, his presidency would be the exit. Instead, the playbook continues to run, the peso remains printable, the IMF stays in the room, and the wealth that was transferred out of Argentine workers and savers over 100 years is gone. It will stay gone, no matter what kind of economist runs the country next. What you should really pay attention to is that none of the most successful countries in the world are 100 years away from where Argentina is right now. They're maybe 30 years away from it. France is already running deficits. Argentina would have called reckless in 1955. Italy's public debt is already past 130% of GDP. Britain had its Argentina moment in 1976 when it had to call IMF, and most British people don't even remember it. Argentina is the warning you're not supposed to take seriously because Argentina is far away and weird and Latin American. But the playbook is universal, and the only thing that varies is the timeline. Argentina's playbook had 4 moves, and they're simple to remember. The state takes discretion over currency, trade, and prices. It used that discretion to redistribute wealth from the politically weak to the politically connected. The currency itself is how the wealth gets moved, and the people who can move their savings into hard assets escape, while everyone else absorbs the loss. Argentina ran that pattern 7 times across 100 years. The actors changed every cycle. The beef oligarchy, Yrigoyen's radicals, Perón's industrialists, the military juntas, Menem's privatization buyers, the Kirchner machine, and now Milei's IMF allies. The vocabulary changed every cycle, but the architecture stayed identical. And if you're watching this from anywhere with a national currency and a structural deficit, that architecture is already running in your country. The only question is how far along the timeline you are. Subscribe to Fortune and Ruin as we continue our autopsy of history's greatest financial events. Let's uncover the financial truths that the history books left out. Your fortune depends on it.